we considered it important to speak today on the issues of European security, meaning also the global security, because in Europe there are growing trends that NATO countries claim their dominance in global scale. Even Indo-Pacific region is now considered as their zone of influence. So what's happening on our continent is of interest not only to the Europeans, not only to those living in North America, but also to other regions of the world, most particularly of the emerging developing countries, who wish to understand what initiatives regarding their regions could be prepared by the NATO countries, who, as I've already mentioned, have claimed their global ambitions. Why we decided to hold this conference today? It's because an event is being inaugurated today in Lodz that used to be called the ministerial meeting of the OSCE. And today it is a good occasion to look at what role was played by this organization since the moment it was established. And you remember the Helsinki Final Act was signed in 1975, and it was considered as the greatest achievement of diplomacy of that time, as a herald of a new era in the relations between the East and the West. However, since that time, there was a growing number of problems, and today the problems of what is being called the OSCE are numerous. These problems have a deep historical perspective and have their roots in the late Soviet period, the late 80s and year 1990, where the number of lost opportunities went beyond all possible expectations, even of the most pessimistic analytics. Remember 1990. It was an anticipation of the end of Cold War, and many even declared the end of Cold War at that time. There was a sense of everyone embracing the universal human values and receiving of the notorious peace dividend. On that same year, 1990, there was a summit of the then Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the CSC, where all participating states, including the countries of the NATO and the Warsaw Treaty Organization, these countries adopted in Paris the Charter for a New Europe that memorialized the end of the era of confrontation and division of the continent, declared elimination of barriers for building a truly pan-European home without any dividing lines. Remember, 1990, it would seem that if everyone has adopted such correct declarations, what prevented us from implementing them? It was because the West failed to take any steps to make sure that these noble intentions turn into real deeds. I think we can say with confidence that at that time the West subscribed to such mottos in an expectation that our country would never regain its positions, neither in Europe nor in the world. They expected, they believed, there was an end of history, and that from that time on everything would follow the rules of global democracy, liberal democracy, so any promises could be made. Interestingly, there is the following fact from that period. The final stage of the preparation for the CSC summit in Paris in 1990, the then Secretary of State, James Baker, warned the President of the United States that it was the CSC that could pose a real threat to the NATO, the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe. I do understand what James Baker meant, it was really so, when the Cold War was coming to an end, many sound politicians believed it would be better to abandon not only the Warsaw Treaty, but also the NATO, and make sure the CSCE becomes a true bridge between the East and the West, a platform where East and West can implement their joint interests based on the balance of interests of all participating states. However, it never happened. Obviously, in reality, the West was seeking to preserve its dominance. There were mottos about the equality, a lack of barriers in the pan-European house, but these principles were considered by the West as a threat to its principles that were aimed at the dominance of the EU and Washington in all affairs, particularly in Europe. So this basic instinct, so the OSCE as a collective instrument of building equal and indivisible security, and it devalued all the lofty documents adopted in the OSCE that have been adopted in the OSCE since the 1990s. It was of principled importance for the West to show who the master was in that pan-European home that everyone has committed oneself to build. And it was back then when the rules-based world order, this concept began. Already then the West considered them as an integral part of their position in global affairs. This sense that Western rules can resolve any problems without consultations with anyone else was the reason why the West considered it possible to bomb Yugoslavia for almost 80 years in a barbaric way, destroying its civil infrastructure, then invade into Iraq and bomb and destroy everything that was needed to ensure the statehood and peaceful life, then destroy the Libyan state and many other operations that you know about. Aggression against Yugoslavia is something we remember because we still feel the repercussions of this event. It was a grave violation of the Helsinki Principles. Then in March 1999, the NATO, let me stress once again, seeking to demonstrate their all-permissiveness, opened a Pandora's box, having flouted the foundations of European security proclaimed in the OSCE. Russia didn't lose its hope that we can get back to the foundations of the Helsinki Principles. We continued our struggle for the OSCE, and at that time we suggested that on the basis of the Istanbul Summit of 1999, we adopt a binding document, namely the Charter of the OSCE. However, the West didn't agree. Nonetheless, as a result of those who were sincerely interested in promoting pan-European approach to all problems, in 1999, important documents were adopted in Istanbul, in particular the Charter for European Security, and they succeeded in adapting the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, to adapt it to the fact of non-existence of the Warsaw Treaty. Because the initial CFE treaty was written where there were two military blocs, the NATO and the Warsaw Treaty. Then the Warsaw Treaty ceased to exist, and obviously the numbers of weapons negotiated in the context of confrontation between the East and the West lost their meaning because many European countries started to be dragged into it. And so after a series of difficult negotiations, this treaty was adapted and signed in Istanbul, something that was declared as an adoption of a document that was designed to become a cornerstone of European stability and security. Unfortunately, you know what happened to it. The US prohibited its allies to ratify the adapted CFE treaty, wishing to preserve the initial conventional forces in Europe treaty that, after the Warsaw Treaty ceased to exist, ensured the NATO dominance on a legal basis. They prohibited the allies to ratify the adapted treaty, and then later they left the ABM treaty, the INF treaty, and finally dismantled the Open Skies Treaty. The OSCE looked at it in a distanced way without having any opportunity to pronounce any collective judgment. It wasn't done neither by the chairmanship in office nor by the Secretaries General. Another document adopted in Istanbul stressed that no one has the right to ensure its own security at the expense of security of others. However, the NATO expansion to the east continued, regardless of all these declarations, endorsed at the top level by all OSCE participating states. Then in 2010, together with some like-minded countries who didn't lose their hope to save the OSCE, we managed to adopt another declaration at the top level. Accordingly, it pronounced that security should be equal and indivisible, that countries have their right to choose alliances, but at the same time, they have no right to do anything whatsoever to strengthen their security at the expense of weakening the security of others. Another important statement was contained in that declaration. No country and no group of countries have the right to claim an exclusive role in the field of security in the Euro-Atlantic region. As you would understand, you are all following the developments in Europe. NATO has violated all of these obligations. NATO expansion posed direct threats to the Russian Federation because military infrastructure went closer and closer to our frontiers. It was prohibited under the Istanbul Declaration. NATO unequivocally stated that only itself would decide whom to grant the binding security guarantees, which also was a direct violation of the Istanbul and Astana declarations. When we realized that these political declarations are being ignored by the NATO, that NATO considers itself possible to pay no slightest attention to them, although they were signed by the presidents, well, we suggested back in 2008, let us codify these political declarations to make them legally binding. But what we heard in response was no. Legally binding guarantees in Europe can only be granted within the NATO. That is, the reckless policy towards artificial expansion, enlargement of this bloc, in the absence of any real threat to the NATO countries, was pursued in a deliberate way. But obviously we do remember how the NATO was established when the first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, proposed the following formula, I quote, "keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down," end of quote. What is happening now means that the NATO is getting back to those conceptual priorities that were developed 73 years ago. Nothing has changed. They want to keep the Russians outside Europe. The Americans want to and have already enslaved Europe. And they keep not only Germans, but the whole European Union down. So after the end of Cold War, the philosophy of dominance, of unilateral advantages, remains in place. In this context, we should remember that throughout the history of its existence, NATO has hardly a record of a single real success story. It only brings devastation and suffering. I've already mentioned aggression against Serbia, aggression against Libya, elimination, destruction of the Libyan statehood, Iraq, and remember the most recent example, Afghanistan. For 20 years, the alliance tried to inculcate its own vision of democracy in this country. And it is telling that they failed to resolve the security issue in the Serbian region of Kosovo, where the NATO has been present for more than 2 decades. And let me stress that speaking about the peacekeeping capabilities of the United States, well, look, for how many decades the U.S. have been trying to bring order to, it would seem, such a small country, Haiti, under their control. It's not Europe, but there are lots of examples, similar examples outside Europe. In 1991, NATO had only 16 member states. Now there are already 30. Sweden and Finland are to join. The alliance deploys its troops and military infrastructure closer and closer to our frontiers, constantly expanding these troops and capabilities. That is bringing closer to Russia. They conduct exercises where almost openly Russia is declared as the enemy, and the NATO intensifies its activities in the post-Soviet states. As I've already mentioned, it expressed its claims for the Indo-Pacific region and now for the Central Asia. This claim for global dominance is a direct violation of the 2010 declaration that, I remember, once again was signed by all presidents and prime ministers of the NATO. Up to the last moment, we tried to keep the situation in Euro-Atlantic from further degradation. In December last year, President Putin put forward new proposals about security guarantees, draft agreement between Russia and the US, and the draft agreement between Russia and the NATO. In this document, we proposed, seeing how insistent the West was in its attempts to drag in Ukraine, which was an obvious red line for Russia, and something the West had known for a long time. In that situation, we proposed to stop the NATO to abandon its further eastward expansion and agree on specific legally binding guarantees for security, both for Ukraine and for the Russian Federation, and for all European countries, for all participating states of the OSCE.
We have seen no discussion. We called to have a comprehensive approach and creative approach to the situation, but we were told that each country, including Ukraine, shall be entitled to join NATO, and you cannot do anything about that. As for other components of this formula of indivisibility of security, that you should not ensure your security at the expense of others, you should not have other organizations to claim its dominance on security in Europe. All these components were simply ignored. So Washington, in December last year, preferred not to use a real chance to de-escalate. But there was indeed such a chance. Not only Washington had its chance, but also the OSCE. It could ease tensions had it managed to resolve the crisis in Ukraine, building upon the Minsk package of measures that was agreed upon in February 2015, and the same month it was endorsed unanimously by the United Nations Security Council. But the executive bodies of the OSCE basically were fully subdued to the US and Brussels, and the US and Brussels decided to comprehensively support the Kyiv regime in its policy to uproot everything Russian, Russian education, Russian media, using of the Russian language, Russian culture, and using of the Russian language in daily life. They supported the Kyiv regime in its course to impose, in legal terms, the theory and practice of Nazism, and such laws were adopted without any response from the educated capitals of Western democracy, and certainly they supported the Kyiv regime in its efforts to turn Ukraine into a foothold for deterring Russia and turning Ukraine into a territory of direct military threats for the Russian Federation. These facts are well known right now, but let me note that when it comes to discrediting the OSCE in Ukraine, a contribution was made by the special monitoring mission of the OSCE in Ukraine in violation of its mandate. It did not respond to daily violations of the Minsk agreements by the armed forces of Ukraine, especially national battalions. The SMM mission basically sided with the Kyiv regime, and after the end of its activities, some indecent facts were exposed. It was collaborating with foreign security services, and somewhat neutral OSCE observers were participating in adjusting fire against the positions of the DPR and LPR militia, and that it collected intel for Ukrainian armed forces and battalions. These battalions and units of the armed forces of Ukraine were provided with data from the security cameras of the SMM, and they were installed close to the line of contact. All these problems were obvious, and many of you, by the way, exposed these problems and brought it to public attention, although not all of the editors agreed to expose them, and the SMM turned a blind eye deliberately to all these violations, including when it comes to the preparation for the military scenario in Donbas, the military seizure of Donbas. Poroshenko and Zelensky, the Kyiv regime, refused to implement the Minsk agreements, and the West tacitly aided and abetted these unacceptable actions. In mid-February, and we have all the statistic data, it cannot be covered. For all these years, there have been shellings of the Donetsk and the People's Republics, and there's been a tenfold increase in the number of shelling. Russia saw an influx of refugees. You know what happened next? We had no other choice but to save the citizens of Donbas and to eliminate security threats for Russia from the Ukrainian territory. We had no other choice but to recognize the independence of the DPR and the LPR, and in accordance with Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, we had to launch, at their request, the special military operation to protect the civilians against Nazis.
Good afternoon. This month, there were joint exercises of the NATO in the Atlantic Ocean and in the Mediterranean Sea. Gerald Air Fort from the U.S. participated in them in particular. In your view, what is the U.S. role in the NATO exercises? What are the U.S. intentions when they are building up military integration with European countries? And how do these joint exercises affect the regional security in Europe? Over the past years, over the past decade probably, the scale of the exercises is growing. They are getting increasingly frequent and more openly aimed against Russia. They might be different scenarios or different titles. They try to conceal the anti-Russian vector, but it's obvious. And they move closer and closer to our frontiers. They are in the Baltics and the Black Sea, and there are land exercises, including in the territory of Poland. And there is a number of other measures that actually run contrary to the Russia-NATO Founding Act signed in 1997, when we managed to negotiate the principles of partnership, as it was called, and it was laid down in the founding document. The key provision of this document was the obligation of the NATO to abandon deployment of considerable combat forces in the territory of new members of the alliance on a permanent basis. A good obligation, but just as in the case with the declarations of 1999 of the OSCE and 2010, it was a political obligation. The OSCE obligations contained the obligation not to strengthen the security at the expense of security of the neighbors, and in the NATO declaration, the NATO-Russia declaration, it was the obligation not to deploy any military troops and not to avoid any permanent stationing of substantial combat forces. It was an outright lie. Probably the naive hopes to preserve partnership with this bloc moved us to work with this bloc. Russia simply recognized the enlargement of the NATO to the east, and NATO solemnly declared that it would avoid additional permanent stationing of substantial combat forces in these new member states. Some time ago, we proposed that we can further strengthen our mutual confidence, so let us interpret this notion of additional permanent stationing of substantial combat forces. So we prepared a legally binding agreement.
So within this agreement, we proposed modalities in accordance of units of what we consider substantial combat forces, brigades, artillery, systems, tanks, and so on. And we believe that that is a professional approach. At the mill-to-mill level, we suggested holding consultations, but NATO strongly denied to have these consultations. They said that it's up to us to decide what these substantial combat forces are, and we undertake not to station them on the territory of new members. And by the way, we undertook not to do it on a permanent basis, but it is possible to rotate them. And currently they violated this pledge. They've been doing it for quite some time, and they station more serious units, more than a brigade, on a non-stop basis, and that is about the rotating principle. The old people leave, but the same day a new team comes in greater numbers. So you represent the Chinese media outlet. I've already said that up till recently, NATO permanently was saying that there should be no security threats to Russia or to any other country from the alliance, because we are a defensive alliance and we protect the territory of our members. When there was the Soviet Union and where there was the Warsaw Pact, it was clear whom this defensive alliance was protecting against, because there was the a line of defense, the Berlin Wall, and then the line of contact between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. So the Warsaw Pact disappeared just like the Soviet Union, and since then there have been 5 waves of NATO expansion. Since they're a defensive alliance, they continue to defend themselves, but nobody understands whom they're defending against. And in June this year in Madrid at the NATO summit, they had no qualms, and they said that we are not just a defensive alliance, and they said that we need to be responsible for global security, primarily for the so-called Indo-Pacific. And an idea was voiced on indivisibility of security of the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific. So this defense line, we do not understand who they're defending against, and NATO is moving this defense line even further eastward. Maybe it will go near the South China Sea. Judging by the rhetoric from London, Brussels, Washington, the South China Sea is becoming one of the regions where NATO is willing to ratchet up tensions, just like they did in Ukraine. We know the serious attitude of the People's Republic of China with regard to such claims, let alone Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait. Such playing with fire by NATO in this region are fraught with risks for the Russian Federation as well, because it is also close to our shores, just like it is close to China. That is why we are developing military cooperation with the People's Republic of China. We are holding joint exercises, anti-terrorist exercises, as well as exercises to monitor, to patrol the coastal area.
As you said just now in your introductory remarks, one of the reasons for the military campaign in Ukraine was to protect Russian speakers. Therefore, how can you justify missile attacks against civilian infrastructure which deprive millions of people the basic human needs of heat, water, electricity, including in regions like Kherson that Russia has claimed as its own territory? How are these justified?
Well, Stalingrad was our territory too, and that is where we attacked the Germans, and in such a way that they fled. You know, our Ministry of Defense and our military experts, not only Russian ones, but also those from the US and military experts of other European countries, point out that our military operation from the very beginning has been implemented in a way that was aimed at minimizing any consequences, any effects for the civil infrastructure and for the civilians. The infrastructure that is now under attack, while they report about it, there are no secrets about it. This infrastructure ensures military potential of Ukraine, its nationalist battalions. These attacks happen with the help of precise weapons. Energy facilities are being eliminated or affected, on which the functioning of the Ukrainian armed forces are dependent, as well as supplies of military equipment with which the West pumps Ukraine to make sure it kills Russians. Recently, one of political figures in Europe said one had to supply weapons that would reach deep into the Russian territory. We see it all, and the talks that the West is interested in a peaceful settlement is something that doesn't impress us. We see the West not only wants to see Russia defied on the battlefield, they say Russia should be eliminated as an actor, and some even convene special conferences thinking of in how many parts Russia should be divided and who would govern which part of it. So we attack the energy infrastructure that make it possible for you to pump Ukraine with little weapons. So don't please mention that the US and NATO are not involved in this war. You are involved in a direct way, not only through the supplies of weaponry, but you also train militaries in your territory, in the territory of Ukraine, of the UK, Germany, Italy and other countries. But apart from trainings on their territories, Western instructors, and there are hundreds of them, are present on the ground. They show Ukrainian militaries how to deal with the machines they are supplying, and there are lots of mercenaries.